Imagine a baby, left alone in a forest. No parents, no hospital, no lullabies, just trees, dirt, and whatever wild animal happens to wander close enough to notice a crying, helpless little creature that smells nothing like a threat. Now imagine that animal doesn't kill the baby. It feeds it. It keeps it warm. It lets it grow up in a den, running on all fours, eating raw food, never once hearing a human word. This sounds like a myth. Romulus and Remus, nursed by a wolf. Mowgli, raised by wolves in the jungle. Tarzan, raised by apes. For most of history, we assumed these were just stories, symbols about nature versus civilization. Except this has actually happened. More than once. Documented, photographed, studied by real doctors and psychologists. And what happens to a human brain and body under those conditions is one of the strangest natural experiments science has ever accidentally been handed. Let's start with the case with the best modern documentation. Ukraine, the 1990s. A little girl named Oksana Malaya was born to alcoholic, neglectful parents, and by around age 3, she began sleeping outside in the family's dog kennel, seeking warmth and safety from the dogs rather than from the adults inside the house. She stayed there for years. When authorities found her at age 8, Oksana didn't walk upright. She moved on all fours. She panted with her tongue out in the heat. She barked instead of speaking, and she reacted to sounds and smells with a sharpness typical children simply never develop. Because typical children don't need those senses to survive. Doctors who examined her described this not as performance, but as a genuinely learned way of existing, built entirely around the dog she grew up beside. With years of intensive therapy, Oksana eventually learned to speak and function largely independently as an adult, though reports describe her as still cognitively behind typical adult benchmarks. Her case remains one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have that early behavior isn't something you're simply born with. It's something you absorb from whoever or whatever happens to be closest to you. Now let's go back 2 centuries. France, 1800. A boy of about 11 or 12 was found wandering naked through woodland near Avarin. He didn't speak. He didn't react to human voices at all. He moved with a strange, hunched, jerky gait and ate by shoving his face directly into food. No hands involved. Scars across his body suggested years surviving alone in the wild. A young doctor named Jean Attard took the boy in, naming him Victor, and spent years trying to teach him to speak and behave in a typical social way. Victor made real progress. He learned to dress himself, follow routines, and even form a genuine bond with Attard's housekeeper. But he never learned to speak in any full sense. A handful of written words was as far as he ever got. This single case became one of the founding examples behind the critical period hypothesis, an idea later formalized by linguist Eric Lenneberg in the 1960s. The theory argues a human brain has a specific developmental window, roughly from infancy through puberty, during which language acquisition happens almost automatically, largely wiring a brain region called Broca's area for full grammar and speech. Miss that window entirely, and the door doesn't close slowly. It appears to close almost completely. Here's a third case, and it comes with an unusually happy ending. Colombia, the 1950s. A young girl, later known as Marina Chapman, was reportedly kidnapped and then abandoned deep in the jungle, where she says she was taken in by a troop of Capuchin monkeys. According to her later account, she learned to climb, forage for fruit and roots, and move through the forest canopy the way the monkeys around her did, for roughly 5 years, before eventually being found by hunters and taken in by a family. Marina's story is harder to verify with the same medical documentation as Oksana's or Victor's, since it comes largely from her own adult memoir decades later. But anthropologists who studied her account noted specific behavioral details, like her description of monkey social hierarchies and grooming behavior, that would be difficult for someone to fabricate without having genuinely observed them up close. Whatever the full truth, her case adds another data point to the same pattern. There's also the case of John Sabunya, a boy in Uganda who fled extreme abuse at home around age 3 or 4 and was reportedly taken in by a troop of vervet monkeys living in nearby forest. When he was found years later, he moved through trees with real agility, ate foraged food, and showed no comprehension of spoken language. After entering a rehabilitation program, he gradually learned to speak and years later became known for singing in a children's choir, a genuinely hopeful turn for a story that began in horror. You'll also come across the widely circulated tale of Amla and Kamala, two girls said to have been discovered living among wolves in India in 1920. It's worth being upfront that many researchers today consider the documentation behind that specific story unreliable and possibly partly invented by the orphanage director who first reported it. Not every viral feral child story holds up the way Oksana's, Victor's, or John's does under real scrutiny. So across the cases that genuinely hold up, a consistent set of patterns keeps showing up, and each one connects to real, testable psychological science. The first is movement. Upright walking isn't purely instinctive. Children develop it substantially through imitation of the people around them. Surround a toddler with animals that walk on four legs, with no upright model available to copy, and the brain simply mirrors what's actually there. This connects to a broader idea in developmental psychology called social learning theory, developed by Albert Bandura, which argues humans learn an enormous amount of behavior not through direct instruction, but simply by observing and copying whoever is around them consistently from the earliest possible age. The second is language, and this is where the critical period hypothesis really shows its teeth. Spoken language isn't just information you memorize. It's a skill requiring specific neural wiring that develops on a schedule, triggered by early exposure speech. Missed a window, and even years of dedicated later teaching tends to produce only partial results, functional communication, without full natural grammar. Exactly the pattern seen with Victor. The third is sensory adaptation. Multiple feral child cases report unusually sharp hearing and smell, and researchers believe this reflects genuine neurological reallocation. When a developing brain doesn't receive rich early language input, it appears to redirect some of that unused processing capacity toward the senses it does rely on heavily for survival: smell, hearing, spatial awareness of a physical environment. The brain isn't wasting resources. It's redistributing them toward whatever actually kept the child alive. The fourth, and the one people talk about least, is attachment. Psychologist John Bowlby's attachment theory argues infants are biologically driven to bond with whatever consistent caregiver keeps them safe, building a lifelong template for trust and security around that bond. Bowlby built his theory around human parents. But these cases suggest the drive itself doesn't require the caregiver to be human at all. If a dog feeds you and keeps you warm every night for years, your nervous system may build its entire foundation of safety around that dog, not around some abstract idea of humanity waiting to be discovered later. Which leads to a genuinely uncomfortable question. How much of what feels fundamentally human to you, your walk, your first language, your instinct for who to trust, is actually fixed from birth? And how much of it is simply what you happen to copy from whoever was standing closest to you during your first few years alive? The honest scientific answer is unsettling in how simple it is. Very little of it is fixed. Compared to almost every other species on the planet, humans are born remarkably unfinished, biologically speaking. Our brains keep forming new neural connections for years after birth, shaped almost entirely by environment rather than instinct. That unfinished quality is normally filled in automatically by parents, siblings, and community. And it's exactly that same openness that allowed Oksana, Victor, Marina, and John to end up partially dog, partially wolf, partially monkey, in the most literal, behavioral sense of the word. It's tempting to file these stories away as sad, strange outliers with nothing to do with the rest of us. But they're actually one of the clearest windows we have into how completely ordinary human development works. You simply got lucky enough that what was nearby was other humans. And that's a strange, quiet truth sitting underneath every one of these stories. Nobody is born speaking, walking upright, or knowing who's safe to trust. Every one of us was built into those things, day by day, shaped by whoever was in the room during our earliest years. For most of us, that room was full of people. For a small handful of children in recorded history, it was full of wolves, dogs, and monkeys instead. And in every single case, the brain did exactly what it was built to do. It became whatever its world taught it to be. Which means the wildest part of this whole story isn't really about wolves or dogs or monkeys at all. It's about how little separates any of us from that outcome. Take away the people in your earliest years, and you take away almost everything you currently think of as simply you,